With the launch of the PlayStation 5 Pro looming, one of the games that has been talked about the most between us here at Digital Foundry is Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. After all, this is a game that launched with some issues, shall we say, on the original PlayStation 5, and the PS5 Pro offers a chance to sort of address those. But it's kind of a complicated situation to talk about, and there are some good and bad elements here with this specific game that makes it different from your typical PS5 Pro patch. And it's funny to say typical, but everything else we've seen is very different from this. But I wanted to talk about this here with you, Oliver, because you are also a fan of this sort of series, game, whatever, and have a lot of experience with the professional.
Yes, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, I think a very controversial game in terms of its graphics and image quality on PS5. Very much improved, thankfully, on PS5 Pro, at least judging from the footage that we do have here, and our experiences, of course.
Yes, exactly. So I kind of first want to rewind back to the launch of this game, because Square Enix put out a demo before the game hit. And it was pretty quick that people kind of jumped on this one, like, hey, what's going on here with the performance mode? The image quality is not great. It actually kind of reminded me of when Horizon Forbidden West hit, where people had issues with that image quality, but it's kind of the reverse. Like, that was overly sharp and like kind of pixely. This was just about the most blurry thing we've seen this generation. And when you actually look at the resolution numbers, it doesn't make that much sense. And they did try to fix this with a patch, but they basically altered the way that it's spatially upscaled from using the linear style filtering to nearest neighbor filtering. But it didn't actually address the core image quality problems. And I think, Oliver, both you and I kind of felt like, even back when this game launched, we were kind of like, yeah, we knew there's a PS5 Pro. This is coming. This is going to happen. Yeah. And with everything else that was going on, I made when I get to the open world, I was like, all right, I might hold off on this for a bit, because having upgraded to a 77-inch screen in my space here, it was just too blurry for my eyes, and I found it almost headache-inducing, to the point where I would have just preferred more of a raw 1080p output with a more, or should I say, less aggressive temporal anti-aliasing. And I feel like you kind of came to some similar conclusions on this.
Yeah, so I ended up playing about 2/3 through the game. I think I'm on chapter 9 or chapter 10, which is pretty late in that game at the moment. But I too gave it up at some point, just because I'm like, you know what, PS5 Pro is coming. At that point, I'd already seen the specs, because it had been leaked, I think in March. We'd already seen everything. So I'm just like, I'm not going to keep subjecting myself to this. I'm just going to wait. But yeah, that initial release was interesting, because the demo came out and it was kind of controversial. The internal resolutions weren't too bad. Like, it was like 1152p-ish, 1224p-ish. It was coming in at some of those numbers there, dynamic resolution in this title. But it was weirdly quite soft. And even in the fidelity mode, I would say it was not 100%. Like, it was 1800p to 4K-ish in that realm when I took a look at it. But it was not 100% sharp like you'd expect from a 4K image in a typical title. It looked more like 1620p, 1800p in terms of the actual detail that was resolved there. Looked a little bit blurry. And what Square Enix did to it is they made the performance mode upscale to 4K using like this weird nearest neighbor thing, but it kind of looked like they were upscaling using nearest neighbor and then maybe downscaling to 4K or something. It looked a little bit soft, but also blocky. Kind of the worst of both worlds there. And it didn't look very satisfying. And then the game came out, and that was the situation. And then after the game came out, I believe they patched it to add in a mode they're dubbing Performance Smooth. So they have Performance Smooth and Performance Sharp, and you basically get to choose between the two different spatial upscaling methods to 4K. Neither one produces a great result. You can kind of pick your poison there, either a little bit sharper, a little bit more blocky, a little bit smoother, a little bit blurrier there. That's kind of your choice. So unfortunately, they didn't manage to rectify it. It is a bit of an unusual situation, because we're so used to games, especially these big AAA games, coming in for better or for worse with relatively sharp imagery, but some image breakup. You know, with upsampling technologies typically. And this was not that case. It was a little bit smoother. Maybe the aliasing presentation wasn't so bad, but that image was actually quite blurry on a 4K set, I would typically say. It was not a very good looking image.
Yeah, exactly. And that's fundamentally kind of the issue here. And before we get into the pro stuff, it's really important to think about this, that I think that this is the fault of the developers making strange choices in regards to image quality. I think and I know the PlayStation 5 as it stands could put out a better image in this game. They made the wrong choices as far as image quality goes, and this is what we ended up with. So this is a case where when we start to look at what the PS5 Pro can offer, it's more that it's sort of compensating for strange development decisions made specifically in regards to this game. Because the game is interesting visually, I would say. I would say overall it looks good. The
Yeah.
cutscenes are absolutely top tier, among the best out there. But the shift to the open world necessitated some changes in the way they do rendering. All the beautifully baked lighting of the original remake
Yes.
kind of had to go away. And so you have these large open environments with very inconsistent, distant detail, strange, not always great looking lighting. You have this mix of assets where it almost looks kit bashed at points, where there's just like high detail assets mixed with very low resolution textures. These are the kinds of things that are just part of the game and can't necessarily easily be resolved. And I don't expect them to be. They weren't really resolved based on our time with the Pro version, and I wouldn't expect a PC version to fix them either. I think that's just what the game looks like, for better or for worse. So it does give you a bit of a whiplash at times, because it can look absolutely stunning, and then it's like, oh, what the heck's going on here?
Yeah, like those cutscenes and the way they're directed.
Oh my
And
gosh.
just this, I mean, they're really extraordinary. The character models have been totally revised. The lighting in the cutscenes looks quite good. Obviously, they can get away with a lot more tricks there. But I think that, yeah, it's the game of, I think I put it in my original coverage, in my original review of the preview in the full game there, that it's a game of very high highs and very low lows, where like you're in the caves and you're looking at like that bizarre lighting that does not match at all with the environment, and you're looking at those ugly rock assets. That's the low. But the high is like these stunningly directed action sequences that I think beat the action sequences in the original game, that are just so beautiful. They're put together so effectively. The character models look stunning. They're some of like the best, I think, cinematic sequences you'll see on a console game today, for sure. That's like the high point. But the low point in some of those open world environments especially can be a little bit lower than you'd like, for sure.
Exactly. And so then there's the quality mode, which definitely produced better image quality, and it looked okay on the regular PS5. But I always felt that, and this is probably controversial to say, but we needed better motion blur there, like camera
Yes,
motion
absolutely.
blur, because
100%.
it just looks very stuttery at 30 FPS with no motion blur, and I found it difficult to stomach at that point. And again, as people know, a 30 FPS can look a little bit rougher on an OLED screen versus an LCD, because there isn't that sort of extra blur that you get from the pixels on an LCD, right? So it does have this very stuttery look, very like gaps in the image, and you really want motion blur to fill that. That's why I felt Final Fantasy 16's quality mode looked quite good at 30
Yes.
FPS. It was because the motion blur was extremely well done. Here, it was not. But of course, everybody has opinions on that. That's why there's options. I wish there had been an option for that. But thankfully, sort of thankfully anyway, we do have an option with the PS5 Pro. It's a very expensive option, shall we say, and an option that I think most people would scoff at if you're just like, yeah, you can just upgrade to the Pro and get FF7 running better. You wouldn't buy a Pro just for this game. But if you're going to get one anyway, this is an interesting use case, because this shows us directly what happens when you rip out the existing solution, which they did, and replaced it with PSSR, which, based on this, is dramatically superior. Like, to the point where I was genuinely shocked to see how, like, it basically looked better to my eye than the game's quality mode, only it runs at 60 FPS now.
Yeah. I mean, that's correct. I mean, just to kind of take you through the range of improvements here, because obviously I did some coverage on this.
Let's do it,
like,
baby.
You can see so much more detail throughout the environment, especially in like texture art, geometric detail. It's just a gigantic improvement. The old TA tended to ghost quite a bit when you move the camera around. Here, the ghosting is very minimal. Like it's almost absent here. It's doing a really good job controlling ghosting here. The game just looks quite a bit better in combat too, where the base game was sometimes a little bit aliased and again very blurry and not handling particle effects too well. PSSR is doing a much better job with that. Here it's doing internal resolutions that are pretty similar to that old title. I think the numbers that I was getting were about 1152p to 1224p on average there, with a high of 1296p, a low of 1080p. So it's a dynamic resolution in the same bounds as the old title, but here being upsampled with PSSR to 4K. I mean, it looks superb. I think image stability overall is a little bit better than that old performance mode as well. The image just looks very, very sharp. I mean, relative to the fidelity mode, there is a bit more breakup in the image than that fidelity mode, but it's also delivering more image detail, which makes me think that there's just something not quite right with the way they've configured their TAA. So for sure, PSSR being added in here, plus they're doing full res post-processing as well, it does seem like. So those two things put together, it does produce a much better looking game in motion and in stills, much, much sharper than either of the old modes in this title. And yeah, I mean, going from basically a 1080p-ish, like appearing like a 1080p or even a bit softer than that appearance on base PS5 up to what is subjectively a very credible looking 4K 60 image, it's a gigantic improvement that I think is going to be quite unique in this title relative to other AAA PS5 titles.
Yeah, so that's an interesting thing because a lot of the stuff that we've seen thus far from the PlayStation 5 Pro is actually centered on first-party games. Or games that are like doing some crazy extra stuff like the F1 stuff and whatnot. But the first party games largely had great image quality, like on regular PS5. So you can't just throw in PSSR and get a night and day difference. Instead, what I feel like this really shows is just how powerful these upsampling machine learning based tools can be in terms of the results they produce. Because as you noted, the actual pixel counts are quite comparable to the original performance mode, but the results are completely different. It really, really is a useful tool for demonstrating how powerful something like this can be. And this is just the beginning, obviously, of PSSR, right? Like these things, there's more training that needs to be done, more refinements that can be done over time. As developers get to grips with it, they can utilize it even better. So it's a very promising first start. But as you said, the key here is just like the extra image clarity, sharpness, and stability of everything.
Yeah,
which is just, we just did not have in the original mode. And it really helps the game sort of come together in a way that it did not before. Because the problem with that blur, if you're in a small confined space, it's perhaps less of an issue. But these open world environments, they stretch out very far from the player, and there's no attempt to sort of mask anything off. And so when you look out into the distance with the original AA solution, it's just a sea of blur. You literally cannot make out the detail. It's just not there. It is now. And that's phenomenal, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, among all the titles that I've looked at on PS5 Pro, and there must be like, I don't know, 11 different games at this point based off of my own personal experiences on hand, and then also the footage that we've been sampled from many different titles. I think this is probably the biggest upgrade, just because on its PS5 version, in that original guise, it was not really delivering the kind of image that we'd expected of a current-gen console title, where usually we're getting like a 1440p-like image, maybe with some breakup that's nasty with FSR2 or whatever, but it might look all right in terms of sharpness. Here, it was not delivering that sharpness. And I think even if they had gone to something like FSR2 in the PlayStation 5 code, that we wouldn't be seeing nearly as good results here, because like the kind of complex movement in Final Fantasy, the zoomed out camera, the really fast action combat, and especially all those particle effects in alpha in those sequences, I think that FSR doesn't really handle that too well at all.
No.
So I think here PSSR is actually doing a great job. In particular, what we've noticed with PSSR and other titles, and as well as this one, is when you subject it to some of these more challenging workloads that would really trip up FSR, complex movement, action combat, particle effects flying everywhere, it's actually doing a really, really good job. And so I think this is a really promising upgrade, and it's a great first sign for what we might see from other titles as well. Like if we are able to get this level of image quality out of titles that are pushing bigger open world environments on PS5 Pro, I think that's a tremendous upgrade. And it can only get better from here, of course, as the model improves and as developers get more familiar with it, right?
Precisely. So very promising first start. I would still say, though, that I think even though FSR2 would likely struggle with this game, it should have produced better results than what we got with the default TAA implementation. Because it's really just not good enough. The other thing though that I would have loved to have seen that we did not see here is I still feel that this game's FOV is way too low. Like to the point of like it's almost claustrophobic, you know what I mean? Like when you're running around a lot of these environments, it just feels like it's so low that there's just, I don't know, it's slightly uncomfortable to me to play it as a result, and I don't like that about it.
I'm not as sensitive to very claustrophobic field of views, but I mean they could definitely do with an FOV slider. I'd certainly encourage every game developer to implement an FOV slider if at all feasible here. And I think in gameplay it should be something that's offered. And I would certainly hope at least that it would be offered for a potential PC release, which we do think is probably coming down the line based off of Square's history with titles like these. Yeah. The
question is, will the PC version actually be better this time?
I'd hope so. I mean, I covered Final Fantasy VII Remake back on PC back 3 years ago now, and oh boy, I mean, that title had some significant issues for sure. It had a massive shader compilation stutter, massive traversal stutter when you're like walking through various villages and towns. To fix it, you could kind of run it in DirectX 11 mode, but then that broke the HDR. It had like no DLSS. It had mandatory DRS as well. You had a few graphical settings. You had like picture quality, shadow quality, and like characters on screen or something, which is like an NPC draw distance setting. Yeah, it was frankly an embarrassing port relative to what you typically see even in other Unreal Engine ports, where you'd have much more control over visual features, where you'd have DLSS, modern upscaling technologies. Certainly you would expect those technologies to be in there, and certainly you would expect a better performance level with less stutter, and of course shader pre-compilation. Those are all issues that I hope are addressed. And I hope that, I hope they're taking their time and doing a reasonably good job here, kind of like they did with FF16, where maybe the result isn't perfect there, but at least it's not nearly as bad as FF7 Remake, I would say.
Yes, but I guess the potential issue here is that this is still an Unreal Engine 4 game, and Unreal Engine 4 plus open world on the PC is usually not a great combo. We've not seen that many examples of games that actually operate as smoothly as you would expect them to on the PC there. So we'll see what happens. But for now, there is at least this option for anybody that's picking up a PS5 Pro and has not played through this game. I'd be curious to see what the cross section actually is in terms of how many people plan to buy the Pro are interested in this game but haven't played it yet and are waiting for the Pro. I don't know. It's going to be interesting.
I mean, certainly the more graphics obsessed among us, like myself and yourself, certainly we put off playing a game, and I think this game is quite a good game, just because of that rendering issue. So hopefully there are other people in a similar boat here, because I kind of hate that this game's first point of contact with the world was in this PS5 version that is not really delivering that kind of 60 FPS experience that you'd expect out of these consoles, unfortunately.
Precisely, indeed. So, plus the demo version they put out initially was not a great looking area to start things, right?
Yeah,
so that was also an issue.
That was an area that had some of the biggest issues in terms of inconsistency of assets. That was probably the worst area, actually. That Mountain Eagle ascent. Yeah,
that's really bad in that regard, which is a shame because there's a lot of good stuff in this game otherwise, visually speaking. And I'm very curious to see where they go next. And yeah, the Pro itself, I guess we'll be getting our hands on it, hopefully again, fairly soon, and can really put this to the test among many other games. But I guess that's probably going to do it for this one. So thanks for joining me, Oliver.
Yes, likewise, Jordan. It was fun.
And thanks for listening here on DF Clips, where you can always count on, well, lots of clips, because that's what we do here on DF Clips. So until the next clip, we'll see you later.